Bullies ripped her shirt. They had no idea she was trained in combat. Kira Valdez pressed her back against the cool metal of her locker, watching the hallway of Riverside High School empty as students rushed to their next classes. She was small for her age, barely 5 feet tall, with a slight frame that made her look fragile. Her dark hair hung like a curtain around her face, which she preferred since it helped her blend into the background. Moving to California from a small town in New Mexico 3 months ago had been difficult enough without the added burden of being the new girl who looked different from most of her classmates. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she gathered her chemistry textbook, trying to ignore the whispers and stares that followed her wherever she went. Being one of the few Latina students at this predominantly white school made her an easy target, and she'd learned quickly that keeping her head down was the safest strategy. What her classmates didn't know was that back home, she'd spent 6 years training in Krav Maga and mixed martial arts with her father, a former Marine who'd insisted she learn to defend herself. But here, she'd made a conscious decision to hide that part of herself, hoping to avoid trouble and just get through her senior year. "Well, well, look what we have here," came a voice that made her stomach drop. Kira turned to see Bryce Morrison approaching with his usual swagger, flanked by his 2 loyal followers. Bryce was everything she wasn't: tall, blonde, and confident in the way that only came from a lifetime of privilege. His father owned half the businesses in town, and Bryce carried himself like he owned the school too. Behind him walked Tucker Reynolds, a stocky football player with mean eyes and a permanent sneer, and Madison Pierce, a girl whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. The 3 of them had made Kira's life miserable since her first day at Riverside High, and she could see in their expressions that today would be no different. "Moving a little slow today, aren't we?" Bryce said, deliberately bumping into her shoulder as he passed. The impact sent her books tumbling to the floor, pages scattering across the polished linoleum. "Oops, sorry about that." Kira knelt to gather her papers, her jaw clenched as she fought the urge to retaliate. She could easily take all 3 of them down, but her father's words echoed in her mind. "Real strength isn't about fighting, Mija. It's about knowing when not to fight." She'd promised herself she wouldn't use her training unless absolutely necessary, hoping to prove she could handle high school like a normal person. "You know, I heard something interesting about you," Madison said, crouching down with false sweetness. "Someone said you're here illegally. Is that true, little immigrant?" Heat flooded Kira's cheeks, but she kept her eyes down, continuing to collect her scattered homework. "I'm American," she said quietly. "Sure you are," Tucker laughed, kicking one of her notebooks further down the hall. "That's what they all say." The late bell rang, and Kira realized the hallway was now completely empty except for the 4 of them. Her heart rate picked up as she recognized the predatory gleam in their eyes. This was exactly the kind of situation her father had trained her for, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Please, I just want to get to class," she said, standing up with her remaining books clutched to her chest. "Oh, but we're not done talking," Bryce said, stepping closer. "See, we've been thinking that maybe you need to learn your place around here. This isn't some border town where you can just waltz in and expect to be welcomed." Kira's hands tightened on her books. Every instinct screamed at her to strike, to use the element of surprise to her advantage. But she'd worked so hard to keep her head down, to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. Maybe if she just endured it one more time, they'd eventually get bored and leave her alone. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said, taking a step back toward the wall. "Well, trouble found you anyway," Madison said with a cold smile. What happened next would replay in Kira's mind for weeks. Tucker grabbed her backpack and dumped its contents across the floor, while Madison accidentally stepped on her calculator, crushing it under her heel. Bryce watched with amusement as tears of frustration began to well up in Kira's eyes. "Oh, is the little girl gonna cry?" he taunted, Maybe you should go back where you came from if you can't handle real American school. Kira bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing herself to kneel down once again to gather her scattered belongings. She could feel them watching her, feeding off her humiliation, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. This pattern continued for weeks. Every day brought new humiliations, new ways for Bryce and his friends to remind her that she didn't belong. They'd accidentally spill drinks on her in the cafeteria, trip her in the hallways, and make loud comments about deportation whenever she passed. Teachers seemed to look the other way, either too busy or too uncomfortable to intervene when the harassment happened right in front of them. The worst part was watching other students' reactions. Some looked uncomfortable but said nothing, while others seemed to enjoy the entertainment. Kira began to understand that in their silence, they were all complicit in what was happening to her. One morning in early November, Kira arrived at school to find something that made her heart skip for an entirely different reason. His name was Jake Martinez, and he was the kind of person who lit up a room just by walking into it. He was tall and athletic, with kind eyes and an easy smile that made everyone around him feel welcome. When he introduced himself in their shared American literature class, Kira felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. "You're Kira, right?" he said after class, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the cafeteria. "I'm Jake. I just transferred here from Arizona." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake was everything she'd dreamed of: handsome, funny, and genuinely interested in getting to know her. For the first time since arriving at Riverside High, she felt like maybe she could have a normal teenage experience. "Want to sit together at lunch?" he asked, and Kira's heart soared. They found a quiet table in the corner of the cafeteria, away from the usual chaos. Jake was easy to talk to, sharing stories about his old school and asking about her life in New Mexico. For 45 minutes, Kira forgot about Bryce and his friends, lost in conversation with someone who actually seemed to value her thoughts and opinions. "So what do you like to do for fun?" Jake asked, stealing a French fry from her tray with a grin. "I used to train in martial arts," she said without thinking, then immediately regretted it. She'd managed to keep that part of her life secret for months. "Really? That's awesome. What kind?" "Krav Maga, mostly. Some mixed martial arts, too." She looked down at her hands, afraid he'd think she was weird or violent. "That's incredible. I've always wanted to learn self-defense. Maybe you could teach me sometime." Before she could answer, a shadow fell across their table. Kira looked up to see Bryce standing there with his usual smirk, Tucker and Madison flanking him like bodyguards. Well, looks like our little illegal found herself a boyfriend," Bryce said loudly, drawing attention from nearby tables. "Jake, right? You might want to be careful who you're associating with around here." Jake's expression hardened. "Excuse me? I'm just saying you seem like a decent guy. You probably don't want to get mixed up with someone like her." Bryce's voice carried across the cafeteria, and Kira felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up her neck. "Someone like what?" Jake stood up, his jaw set in a way that made Kira's pulse quicken. "You know exactly what I mean," Madison chimed in with false sweetness. "She's not really one of us, if you catch my drift." Kira grabbed Jake's arm, trying to pull him back down. "It's okay," she whispered. "Just ignore them." But Jake wasn't the type to back down from bullies. "Actually, I think you need to apologize to her right now." Tucker laughed harshly. "Or what, pretty boy? You gonna make us?" The cafeteria had gone quiet, with everyone watching the confrontation unfold. Kira felt trapped, caught between her desire to protect Jake and her fear of making the situation worse for both of them. "Just walk away," she pleaded, but Jake's attention was fixed on Bryce. "I'm not going anywhere until you apologize for being racist jerks," Jake said firmly. That's when things escalated beyond anything Kira had experienced before. Bryce's mask of casual cruelty slipped, revealing something much darker underneath. He stepped closer to Jake, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried across the silent cafeteria. "You want to be a hero? Fine. But understand that your little girlfriend here is going to pay for this later." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Kira saw the way Jake's hands clenched into fists, saw the moment he realized what kind of people he was dealing with. A teacher finally approached, breaking up the confrontation before it could turn physical, but the damage was done. "This isn't over," Bryce said as they walked away, his eyes locked on Kira's face. "Not even close." That afternoon, Kira's fears proved justified. She was leaving her last class when she found Jake waiting by her locker, his face grim. "They cornered me in the parking lot," he said without preamble. "Bryce and his friends, they made it pretty clear that if I keep hanging around you, things are going to get ugly." Kira's heart sank. "I'm sorry. I never wanted you to get dragged into this." "Hey, don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." Jake reached out and took her hand, sending warmth shooting up her arm. "I'm not going to let them intimidate me." "You don't understand," Kira said, pulling her hand away. "They're relentless. They won't stop until they get what they want. Then we'll deal with it together." But Kira could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he glanced around the hallway as if expecting an attack. She realized that by getting close to Jake, she'd painted a target on his back, too. The thought made her sick. Over the next few days, Bryce and his friends proved that their threats weren't empty. They began targeting Jake with the same systematic cruelty they'd shown Kira, but with an added vindictiveness that made her blood boil. They spread rumors about him, vandalized his locker, and made his life miserable in ways that were carefully calculated to avoid teacher intervention. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in December. Kira was walking to her car after school when she heard shouting from behind the gymnasium. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized Jake's voice, strained with pain and anger. She ran toward the sound, rounding the corner to find a scene that made her see red. Jake was on the ground, his lip bleeding, while Bryce and Tucker stood over him. Madison was recording everything on her phone, laughing as if it was the most entertaining thing she'd ever seen. "Had enough yet?" Bryce was saying. "Or do you need another lesson about sticking your nose where it doesn't belong?" Jake tried to get up, but Tucker shoved him back down. "Stay down, hero boy. This is what happens when you don't listen." That's when they noticed Kira standing there, frozen in horror. Bryce's face lit up with cruel delight. "Perfect timing," he said. "Your girlfriend can watch us finish what we started." "Leave him alone," Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Madison called out mockingly. "Speak up, little mouse." "I said leave him alone." This time, her voice carried more strength, though her hands were shaking. Bryce laughed. "Or what? You'll call your family to come save you? Oh wait, they're probably too busy hiding from immigration to help." Something snapped inside Kira at that moment. Months of bottled-up anger and frustration came rushing to the surface, along with a protective rage she'd never felt before. Jake was hurt because of her, because he'd tried to stand up for her when no one else would. "You want to know what I'll do?" she said, her voice steady now. "I'll show you." She took a step forward, and for the first time since she'd known him, Bryce actually looked uncertain. There was something in her posture, something in the way she moved that didn't match the timid girl they'd been tormenting for months. "Kira, don't," Jake said from the ground, but she was already committed. "You've spent months trying to make me feel small," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Making me feel like I don't belong here. But you know what? I'm done being afraid of you." Tucker stepped forward threateningly. "You better watch your mouth, little girl." "No," Kira said, and suddenly her father's training took over. Her stance shifted, her weight distributed perfectly, her hands loose at her sides. "You better watch yours." The change in her demeanor was so complete that even Madison stopped recording, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Kira had spent months hiding her true self, but now there was no point in pretending anymore. "I tried to avoid this," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "I tried to keep my head down and just get through school. But you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Bryce's face reddened with anger. "You think you're tough now, just because you're running your mouth? I think you're about to find out." Tucker moved first, lunging toward her with obvious intent to grab and intimidate. But Kira wasn't the same frightened girl who'd been cowering in hallways for months. She sidestepped his clumsy attack with fluid grace, using his own momentum against him. Her elbow found his solar plexus with surgical precision, and Tucker dropped to his knees, gasping for air. The shock on Bryce and Madison's faces was almost comical. They'd never seen Kira move like that, had never imagined she possessed such skill and confidence. "That's impossible," Madison whispered, but Kira was already turning toward Bryce. "Your turn," she said simply. Bryce's face went through a range of emotions: disbelief, fear, and finally rage. "You little freak," he shouted, swinging wildly at her head. Kira ducked under his punch and responded with a quick jab to his ribs that made him double over. Years of training had taught her exactly where to hit to cause maximum impact with minimal effort. She wasn't trying to seriously injure them, just to make them understand that she wasn't helpless. "Stop!" Madison screamed, but Kira was beyond listening. Bryce straightened up, his face twisted with fury and something else: fear. For the first time in his life, he was facing someone who wasn't intimidated by his size or his reputation. He threw another punch, this one more desperate than before. Kira caught his wrist, twisted it behind his back, and used a simple leverage technique to send him to the ground. The movement was so smooth and effortless that it looked like a dance. Bryce hit the asphalt hard, his confidence shattered along with his dignity. "Please," he gasped, his voice cracking. "I give up." "Ray!" Kira stood over him, her chest barely rising from exertion. She could hear students gathering around them, drawn by the commotion. Word was spreading fast that the quiet new girl had just taken down the school's biggest bully. "You give up?" she repeated, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Just like that?" Bryce nodded frantically, all his arrogance gone. Tucker was still on his knees, holding his stomach, while Madison stood frozen in shock. This was the moment Kira had been trained for, the moment when she had complete control over her opponents. She could humiliate them the way they'd humiliated her. She could make them pay for every cruel word, every pushed book, every moment of fear they'd caused her. Instead, she stepped back and extended her hand to help Bryce up. "I don't want to fight you," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I never did. All I wanted was to be left alone." Bryce stared at her hand for a long moment before taking it, allowing her to pull him to his feet. The gesture was so unexpected that murmurs rippled through the crowd of onlookers. "You could have really hurt us," he said quietly, his voice filled with something that might have been respect. "Yes," Kira agreed, "but that's not who I am." She turned to help Jake up, her heart racing as she saw the admiration in his eyes. He was looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time, and in a way he was. "Are you okay?" she asked, gently touching his split lip. "I'm perfect," he said, his voice full of wonder. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to fight like that?" "My father taught me," she said simply. "He wanted me to be able to protect myself." By Monday morning, the entire school knew what had happened. The story had grown in the telling, with some versions claiming Kira had single-handedly taken down the entire football team. But the truth was impressive enough. The quiet new girl had stood up to the school's biggest bullies and won. The change in how people treated her was immediate and dramatic. Students who had ignored her for months suddenly wanted to sit with her at lunch. Teachers who had looked the other way during the harassment now made a point of greeting her in the hallways. Even some of the popular kids started treating her with a respect she'd never experienced before. But the most significant change was in Bryce himself. He approached her at her locker on Tuesday morning, his usual entourage notably absent. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "What I did to you, what I said, it was wrong. I was wrong." Kira studied his face, looking for signs of sarcasm or deception. Instead, she found something she'd never seen before: genuine remorse. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of change, scared of people who were different from me. I took it out on you because I could, because I thought you wouldn't fight back." "I didn't want to fight back," Kira said. "I wanted to prove I could fit in without violence." "You did prove it," Bryce said. "You proved you were better than me in every way. I just wish I'd realized it sooner." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. The school is better with you in it." As Kira watched him walk away, she realized that this was what her father had meant about real strength. It wasn't about the ability to hurt others. It was about the wisdom to know when not to, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Jake appeared at her side, slipping his hand into hers. "So what now?" he asked. Kira smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time since arriving at Riverside High. "Now we just be ourselves," she said. "No more hiding, no more fear. Just us." Looking back, she realized that the confrontation had changed everyone involved. Bryce had learned humility, Tucker had discovered that cruelty had consequences, and Madison had seen that actions had real impact on real people. The other students had learned that standing by while someone was being hurt made them complicit in the harm. But most importantly, Kira had learned that she didn't have to choose between being strong and being kind. She could be both, and that combination was more powerful than any martial arts technique her father had ever taught her. As she walked through the hallways of Riverside High with Jake by her side, Kira felt like she truly belonged for the first time. Not because she'd proven she could fight, but because she'd proven she could choose not to fight when it mattered most. That was the kind of strength that would serve her well beyond high school, the kind of strength that could change the world one person at a time.